Bonjour madame and monsieur. Hi everyone, in this video I'll tell you about top 20 French novels the country has produced in the span of 6 centuries. These are some of the most original novels in the world in terms of unique writing style, engaging themes, and innovative storytelling techniques. I have carefully chosen the novels that have stood the test of time. Also, these novels are all by different authors, so in this video you will also learn about France's top 20 authors of all time. I will talk about the novels in chronological order from first to last, so the video also provides you with a brief history and evolution of the French literature. So you can get to learn about 20 of the best French novels by 20 world-class authors in the span of 600 years. But first thing first, why should you read French literature? Well, a few reasons. First, if Japanese literature is about a bunch of lonely people drifting around, and Russian literature is a massive punch in the face, I describe French literature like tickles in my nostril and taste buds. Reading French novels seem like déjà vu, as if I'm reading myself. You can smell a French novel, experiential and deeply existential. Second, the French have invented the novel. Well, if they haven't, they have made it into a literary form, established it as a tool of expression, turned it into an art form. France has produced good wine, smelly cheese, bread in the shape of baseball bat, and novels. French novels have a very artistic feel to them. It's no surprise that French writers have won the most number of Nobel Prize in literature than any other country. But winning Nobel Prize is not the main parameter of a country's literature. Finally, France has been Europe's literary hub for centuries. France allowed a bit more freedom for its people to write more freely due to its freedom of speech laws. Also, French writers have more often pushed the boundaries. So numerous authors from around the world, especially Europe and America, went to France to create a vibrant art scene and literary discussion. Okay, let's dive in. Gargantua and Pantagruel by François Rabelais. François Rabelais, on top of being a comic genius, was a monk, physician, and a Greek scholar. Gargantua and Pantagruel is satirical adventures and mishap of two giants, Gargantua the father and his son Pantagruel. Crazy, grotesque, crude, vulgar, and full of contradictions that combines the highbrow with lowbrow. It takes a very liberated view of making fun of life and existence as if nothing is sacred or important. There is a sense of freedom in this book that will surprise you even 600 years later. Just imagine that it was published in 16th century, around the same time as Galileo was put to death for his scientific beliefs. I think Rabelais was influenced by Erasmus, and especially his book In Praise of Folly, which has a similar tone that we should not take things too seriously. Here's a quote. "Seeing how sorrow eats you, defeats you, I would rather write about laughing than crying. For laughter makes men human and courageous." Here's another one. "I have a remedy against thirst, quite contrary to which is good against the biting of a mad dog. Keep running after a dog, and he will never bite you. Drink always before the thirst, and it will never come upon you." You get the idea. Despite its vulgarity and childishness, it was meant to be educational on humanist values. It had a huge influence on the famous English novel Tristram Shandy by Laurence Sterne, published in 1760s. Rabelais is often referred to as the greatest writer of French language, and this book is considered a pioneer of satire and a bridge between pre-modern and modern French literature. My next pick is a play by one of the most celebrated French playwrights, The Misanthrope by Moliere. Moliere was the most celebrated French actor and playwright and often called the Shakespeare of France and said to have created modern French comedy. He spent 2 years in prison for unpaid debt, which resulted in him contracting tuberculosis that led to his death on stage later in his life. He's famous for writing great satirical plays that were so sharp that was constantly subject to ban and censorship. The Misanthrope is his best known play of comedy of manners about an idealistic man who avoids people and doesn't play nice. His too individualistic approach is not liked by others. The play is a criticism of hypocrisy among the French aristocrats at the time. Its main theme is the balance between individual freedom and social norms, something we grapple with even today. Here's a quote. "My hate is general. I detest all men. Some because they are wicked and do evil, others because they tolerate the wicked." My next choice is a philosophical novel, Candide by Voltaire. Voltaire is considered one of the most influential European Enlightenment philosophers. He is famous for his secular, human-centered philosophy in defending free speech and individual freedom. The most famous quote, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it," is often attributed to Voltaire, but it was by his biographer who summed up his philosophy. Candide, or Optimism, is his most famous novel that came after a few terrible events in Europe, namely the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. It's about a man who believes in the philosophy of optimism, popularized by the German philosopher Leibniz. Candide is exposed to all kinds of adventures and hardships in life. He even visits El Dorado, a mythical town where everything is perfect, even the streets are made of gold. Despite being a heaven-like place, Candide is still not satisfied. His adventures take him from Europe to South America, and finally he settles somewhere in Turkey. Enlightenment philosophy is often defined as humans becoming adults, therefore rational and practical, rather than living in religious bubbles. It's a coming-of-age novel with an individualistic message that we each has to cultivate our own garden. In other words, we are each responsible to find our own meaning and paths in life instead of following a collective ideology or religion. Quote, "If this is the best of possible worlds, what then are the others?" End quote. Okay, from philosophy to the art of seduction. Dangerous Liaison by Père Choderlos de Laclos. Père Choderlos de Laclos was a soldier, but he's famous for his single novel, The Dangerous Liaisons. The novel is about the art of sexual seduction told in a series of letters. Two aristocratic men challenge one another to seduce female targets, often too difficult for fun and game. It depicts the decadence of the French aristocracy just prior to the French Revolution, and thus sometimes considered as a critique of the system that allowed rich people to play stupid games while most of the French people suffered in poverty. At the time of its publication, it was a hugely scandalous book, as it's full of manipulation, scheming, revenge, betrayal, and some romantic love. The novel has inspired numerous films both in France and in America. Here are a couple of quotes. "Humanity is not perfect in any fashion, no more in the case of evil than in that of good. The criminal has his virtues, just as the honest man has his weaknesses." And here's another one. "Don't you remember that love, like medicine, is only the art of encouraging nature?" My next choice is about social climbing. The Red and the Black by Stendhal. Stendhal, like Voltaire, is a pen name, was a pioneer of realism. He has also given his name to Stendhal syndrome, when you see something so beautiful that it makes you sick. When visiting Florence for the first time, Stendhal was awe-stricken by the beauty of the city. The Red and Black is about an ambitious yet idealistic young man from the country trying to rise in society, but faces many challenges due to his class. In his romantic quests with women of high society, his naivety is exposed, and finally things reach a stage where the protagonist takes things into his own hand with a huge gun trying to kill the woman he had an affair with. The incident sends him to prison, and the ending is tragic. The novel was a critique of French society dominated by aristocracy that prevented social mobility. Here's a quote. "The ordinary procedure of the 19th century is that when a powerful and noble personage encounters a man of feeling, he kills, exiles, imprisons, or so humiliates him that the other, like a fool, dies of grief." The Red and the Black also questions the idea of love itself. You only love someone who is hard to get. Okay, now from class inequality to gender inequality. Indiana by George Sand. George Sand, like George Eliot, despite having a male name, was a female novelist. Her real name was Amantine Lucille Aurora Dupin. At one point, the famous Polish composer Chopin was her lover. She was also a close friend of Gustave Flaubert. She was very popular during her lifetime in England, more so than Balzac and Hugo. She influenced Fyodor Dostoevsky, who translated her work to Russian. Indiana is about a young girl from the colonies who marries an older man in Paris. But their marriage is not happy, so she falls in love with a neighbor. But things are more complicated due to her class and gender, exposing inequalities in Paris at the time. The novel depicts the complexity of romantic love and power play that goes on between men and women. At the end, Indiana falls in love with Rolf, her cousin, and they chose to live simple life. Apart from the ending, which I found a bit far-fetched, the novel is beautifully written. Here's a quote: "The most honest man is the one who thinks and acts best, but the most powerful is the one who writes and speaks best." Okay, from romance to human comedy. Père Goriot by Honoré de Balzac. Balzac was not a writer, he was a machine. In his human comedy series, he wrote about 90 novels and novellas in 30 years, trying to capture every aspect of life in Paris. That's 3 novels per year, and he had no computer, just used quill. Who knows how many birds he killed? And he only lived for 51 years. He's often called the father of social realism and influenced writers like Charles Dickens, Gustave Flaubert, Émile Zola, and even Karl Marx. Père Goriot is about 3 characters. An old man, Père Goriot, who sacrifices his life for his family but gets nothing in return. Then there's a criminal who sees Paris as a jungle like a Darwinian world. Only the cleverest can survive and get to eat. And finally, a young countryman who has moved to Paris trying to rise in society, and in the course of the novel is educated in the ways of Paris, some pleasant and some unpleasant. The main theme is class inequality, family relationship, and love. Quote, "In this world, nothing is complete but human misery." My next pick is one of the most famous novels of adventure. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Alexandre Dumas was a novelist and a playwright, and his stories are famous for their adventures, dramas, fantasy, and romance. Not just a prolific writer, he was also sexually adventurous. He's said to have had affairs with 40 women, and also smoked a lot of hashish. The Three Musketeers, his most famous novel, is about a young man called Count D'Artagnan and his 3 friends, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, or the Three Musketeers. They bond together to fight crimes, expose plots against the king, engage in brave battles, pursue chivalric romances, and many adventures. This novel is lighter to read, and events are much more dramatic and exciting. The famous quote is, "All for one and one for all. United we stand, divided we fall." It's mainly about male friendship or bromance. Okay, from chivalric men to a woman defying traditions. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Gustave Flaubert was a literary stylist. If novelists were hairdressers, you would want your hair cut by Flaubert. He was a slow writer, only produced like 3 novels, but his language is incredibly rich and his writing is immensely beautiful. If I have to compare him to a modern-day novelist, perhaps Kazuo Ishiguro, both are very slow and methodical. Of course, this comparison makes no sense as times has changed and so has novel writing. Flaubert is one of my favorite French writers. His most famous novel is Madame Bovary, about a married woman who engages in a few affairs to get some excitement in life. When affairs become dull, she starts shopping. But you know where it all ends. Today the story might seem quite mundane, but go back 150 years ago, it was revolutionary and extremely scandalous. When it was published, it was banned and Flaubert was taken to court for writing so explicitly about women's desire and their sexual freedom. I spoke about this novel in a much more detail in my other video on French literature, which I'll link down below if you like to watch. I cannot recommend this novel enough. Here's a quote. "Love, she thought, must come suddenly, with great outbursts and lightning. A hurricane of the skies, which falls upon life, revolutionizes it, roots up the will like a leaf, and sweeps the whole heart into the abyss." Okay, from a woman seeking romantic adventures to a man seeking justice and redemption. Les Misérables, or The Miserables by Victor Hugo. Well, Hugo is the hugest French writer. I mean the greatest. He was part of the Romantic movement, a critique of modernity and capitalism. Les Misérables is perhaps the most famous and well-known French novel of all time, with millions of its adaptations into movies, plays, and also quite a project to read due to its merciless length, more than 1,000 pages. It's about a man who spends almost 20 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread. Once freed, he commits another crime and he's almost caught red-handed again, but fortune smiles at him and he tries to make amends. Despite his best effort to reinvent himself and rise up in society, the police continue to pursue him. The novel is an indictment on the then French justice system and class inequality. Despite its very powerful message, the novel is too long, too digressive at times. But if you get past those, it's one of those books that will leave you with tears in your eyes and your heart filled with goodness and faith in humanity. Quote, "The future has several names. For the weak, it's impossible. For the faint-hearted, it is unknown. But for the valiant, it's ideal." My next one is about an outsider climbing the social ladder with ruthless precision. Bel-Ami by Guy de Maupassant. Guy de Maupassant is one of the greatest French short story writers. He was a student of Flaubert and had a very pessimistic outlook, and apparently Friedrich Nietzsche was one of his admirers. Also, he wasn't a big fan of the Eiffel Tower. His most celebrated novel is Bel-Ami, about a man who rises in Parisian society by deceiving rich women. He is ruthless. His only goal is to conquer women and better position for himself. Earlier I mentioned Balzac had such character who likened society to a jungle. Here the main character executes his plan of ascent like a military commander. He spent 3 years as a soldier in Algeria, which must have given him the outlook. You might even read him as a working class man conquering territories that belong to the upper class. There are a few secrets, betrayals, and a lot of dramas. But what's interesting is that the protagonist has very few setbacks despite his ruthless rise. Here's a quote, "Life is a slope. As long as you're going up, you're always looking towards the top and you feel happy. But when you reach it, suddenly you can see the road downhill and death at the end of it. It is slow going up and quick going down." Okay, from class mobility to class struggle. Germinal by Émile Zola. Émile Zola belonged to the naturalist tradition that combined realism with psychological and emotional expression of characters. In my video on August Strindberg of Sweden, I discussed that he was a good friend of Zola. Zola was a very successful writer in his lifetime and made huge sum of money with his writing. Also a huge celebrity. He famously risked his career to defend a Jewish officer wrongly accused. So he was a man of principle. His most famous novel, Germinal, refers to germinating of seeds, thus considered a scientific effort by Zola to understand society. It is about a naive yet idealistic young mine worker who tries to better his life, a common theme in all 19th century literature. While working at the mine, the young man shows keen interest in socialism. But as things heat up, he becomes the leader among the miners, who decide to go on a strike, but it results in suppression by the police and army. Later, the young man is trapped inside the mine and finally released and fired from his job. The theme of the novel is the struggle of humans, the nature of violence, and raw emotions. Even to this day, the novel has a special place among the French working class. Here's a quote, "There is only one thing that warms my heart, and that is the thought that we are going to sweep away these bourgeoisie." Okay, from social inequality to recapturing past romances. La Grande Molna by Alain-Fournier. Alain-Fournier was a soldier but wrote a single novel. He died in the First World War before he could finish his second novel. His body was not identified. La Grande Molna is based on Alain-Fournier's own experience of falling in love with a girl at first sight and the chance encounters in life that decide your fate for years to come. The novel inspired The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, in which a man pursues a past love with terrible consequences for all. Both novels are narrated by a third person and about men who try to recapture a magical romance of the past. In both novels, the narrators are the catalyst for the lovers to meet again. The ending of this novel is also somewhat tragic, but also thought-provoking. Here's a quote. "We said to him, 'Here's your happiness. Here's what you spent your whole youth looking for. Here's the girl you saw in all your dreams.' How could anyone, pushed by the shoulders like that, avoid a reaction of indecision, then fear, then dismay? How could he resist the temptation to escape?" While reading, I could see some similarities with my next choice. Okay, from past romantic obsessions to living an artistic legacy. In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. Okay, what can I say more about Proust that I haven't already said? I've made 3 separate videos talking about Proust and his masterpiece, In Search of Lost Time. Proust is still my favorite writer of all time, and In Search of Lost Time holds the record for the longest novel, but also the most abundant novel. If there's one novel in the world that has time as one of its main characters, it is In Search of Lost Time. Time, the killer of everything. Time, the merciless enemy of life. time in this novel is gloriously murdered in about 4 scenes. How? In the most beautiful Prussian way, through involuntary memory triggered by taste and smell that transport our hero Marcel to his past. In those moments, Marcel is free from time. If you want to get a full summary, I have a specific video here. If you want to learn from Proust, watch my video 10 lessons we can learn from Proust. If that's not enough, I made a third video where I talk about Proust and some common French cultural stereotypes. I'll make a French literature playlist and link it down below. Here's a quote: "My destination is no longer a place, rather a new way of seeing." Okay, from capturing and defeating time to questioning the complexities of modern life. Journey to the End of the Night by Louis-Ferdinand Céline. Louis-Ferdinand Céline is sometimes likened to James Joyce in his use of vulgar, obscene language. He's also famous for his controversial politics, siding with the Germans and fleeing to Denmark after World War II. Journey to the End of the Night, his most famous novel, is about a medical student won over by patriotic feeling enlists himself to fight the Germans in World War I. But once at the front line, he realizes those Germans have done nothing wrong to him and questions the whole idea of war. It is somewhat similar to Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, as both novels depict the absurdities of war and the characters trying to escape it all. The protagonist drifts around the world, from France to Africa, then America and back to Paris, where he becomes a doctor. The novel is full of funny but tragic ironies and absurdities of life, in similar fashion to Albert Camus' novels or Franz Kafka's. The novel was written in a working-class vernacular, using a lot of slangs and vulgar words, but it also has a Freudian vibe, as someone is reflecting at the stupidities and ironies of human life with a quite pessimistic lens, in a somewhat Darwinian survival of the fittest way. Quote, "Suddenly he fell asleep in the candlelight. After a while I got up to look at his face. He slept like everybody else. He looked quite ordinary. There ought to be some mark by which to distinguish good people from bad." Okay, from questioning the madness of war to absurdities of modern existence. The Stranger by Albert Camus. Albert Camus is a philosopher, football or soccer player, and a Nobel Prize-winning novelist. He died in a car accident at the age of 46. He's famous for his existential philosophy that human life is absurd and has no inherent meaning. Camus' most famous novel, The Stranger, is a philosophical novel about Meursault, a Frenchman who is indifferent. When his mother dies, he doesn't cry. Quote, "At that time, I often thought that if I had to live in the trunk of a dead tree with nothing to do but look up at the sky flowing overhead, little by little, I would have gotten used to it." Then, in Algeria one day, on a beach, he is confronted by an Arab and he shoots him a few times. On his arrest, he confesses to the murder, but when asked why he killed the man, his answer is that it was sunny. At the court, his lack of remorse is played out to show the man is a monster. Camus himself wrote about the novel, quote, "In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death." Meursault is sentenced to death and refuses to talk to the chaplain and slowly accepts his fate, waiting for his death. Quote, "Maman used to say that we can always find something to be happy about. In my prison, when the sky turned red and a new day slipped into my cell, I found that she was right." Okay, from an existential novel to the dichotomy of child versus adult perspectives. Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. Antoine Saint-Exupéry was also a pilot who once crashed in a desert, which must have inspired this novel. The Little Prince is considered a children's book, but I have included in this list for having such a massive impact around the world. I've spoken about this in my other video, but just to give you a glimpse of the story, it's about an alien prince who visits Earth. He tells the story of his journey visiting 6 planets, in all of which lived strange people who did useless things. It's from a child's point of view, looking at adults' world and thinks how stupid. Quote, "The most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or touched. They are felt with the heart." Okay, my next pick is also about young versus old way of looking at life. Gigi by Colette. Colette wrote many novels, but she's well known for Gigi. It's a very short novella, more like a short story, but with a happy ending. It's about a young girl who is educated for high society, but the high society is not a straightforward kind of world, with a lot of hypocrisy and pretentiousness. If Gigi is trying to climb up, then Gaston, the other character, is trying to climb down from high society for a more simpler life. It's a story of young versus old and how their points of view of happiness in life differs. Young people are excited to see what's on top of the mountain, while the ones who have been there think it's better down below. The ending is a bit abrupt, but other than that, it's a lovely story, short, simple, and to the point. Now, from a man trying to simplify life to a man trying to leave no trace of himself on earth. Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec. Perec was a filmmaker, writer with a unique literary style. He grew up in a Jewish working-class family. This is one of the most unique but also bizarre novels on this list. If Proust was hopeful about leaving an artistic legacy behind to keep him alive for centuries to come, Perec questions that very idea of legacy. Life, a User's Manual is about an Englishman who decides to spend the rest of his life and money on a project, perhaps as a form of legacy. He spends 10 years learning to paint, then 20 years traveling around the world painting 500 pictures. In Paris, his paintings are put on a board but cut out in a form of jigsaw puzzle. He spends the next 20 years to solve the puzzle and send back each painting to the place he painted them. At the end of his life, his plan is to have nothing to show to the world for the last 50 years of his life, or leave no mark whatsoever. But he goes blind, and before he can finish the jigsaw puzzle, he dies. But here's the biggest heartbreaking twist of all. The last piece of the jigsaw puzzle left to be placed doesn't fit. It's a very complex novel in terms of structure, as it follows the floor plan and rooms of an apartment building in Paris. There are so many moving parts, like a chessboard. It's a kind of mirrors the complexities and ironies of life itself. Okay, from a Paris apartment to the Mekong River of Indochina. Okay, finally, The Lover by Marguerite Duras. This novel is about a 15-year-old French girl's love affairs with a 27-year-old Chinese Vietnamese man. The novel is set in Vietnam during the French occupation of Indochina, and the lovers meet on the Mekong River. The man's parents do not approve of their love, so he breaks up with her. It's based on Duras' own life in Indochina. Quote, "The story of my life does not exist. There's never any center to it. No path, no line. There are great spaces where you pretend there used to be someone, but it's not true. There was no one." I found the writing to be very beautiful and convincing. Okay, it's a very long list. I hope you enjoyed it or learned something from it. The two French novelists that I have spent the most time with are Marcel Proust and Gustave Flaubert. They were amazing artists, and that's what I love about French literature. Let me know if I've missed some great French novels. What's your favorite French novel or novelist? Merci beaucoup. Thank you for watching.